to chapter 3. So this week we're going to talk about culture and society. And so culture is people's entire way of life. The great thing about chapter 3 is now we get to dive into things that have to do with you and your everyday life, and you can kind of examine yourself in relationship to the material that will be presented in this and future chapters. So culture includes things like the way that people dress, the activities that people engage in, the expectations of people, the social relationships they have, anything to do with people and the way that they live their lives, culture has to do with. But the thing about culture, it's kind of like water for a fish or air for us. Before I mentioned air, were you thinking about it? Most likely not. The thing is, unless air changes temperature or moves in a certain direction, we don't really pay attention to it. Although it's something that we constantly interact with every moment of our lives, or most moments of our lives, I should say. And that's kind of how culture is. It's something that influences almost everything we do almost all the time, but it's something that we're not necessarily aware of because we've been inundated by culture our entire lives that we don't even notice its effect on us. So that's kind of my challenge to you this week is for you to start noticing the ways in which culture shapes your behavior. So let's talk about the components of culture. Two main components of culture, as your book talks about. We've got material culture. So those are the physical objects that we are going to use in our everyday lives, right? So things like cars are part of material culture. And then we've got everything else, which we would kind of classify under this large umbrella as non-material culture. So let's talk about some of those things that make up non-material culture. One is signs or symbols. Signs or symbols are things that meaningfully represent something else. So the stop sign, for example, it means stop, right? But stop what? Stop eating, stop drinking, stop dancing, stop singing, stop talking, stop yelling? No, stop driving, right? So it carries a specific meaning. Now you might be thinking to yourself, but wait a second, when I drive down the road and I see a stop sign, it's made of metal, it's a material object. Well, you're not wrong. Stop signs are material objects, but what's most important about them is the meaning that they carry, not necessarily their use as a physical object. So that's why we put stop sign under symbolic or non-material culture as a symbol rather than as a part of or a component of material culture. Other things that we would classify as signs or symbols are flowers, right? They meaningfully represent something that love or care, right? Congratulations, all the different reasons that we would give someone flowers. Now, the thing about symbols is that they can change over time. This is an example of a symbol that has changed over time, and symbols can also be incredibly powerful, right? This is a symbol that elicits a very strong emotional reaction in individuals, right? Reinforcing the power that symbols have. Now, symbols can also mean different things to different people. Here's another example of a very powerful symbol that's also very contentious symbol. It means something very different to different groups of people. And depending on the person you ask, they might say that this is a symbol of racism, or they might say that this is a symbol of Southern culture and heritage. Another system of symbols is language, right? And so language can be written, it can be verbal, it can be nonverbal. But the thing about language is it doesn't always translate, even when we're speaking the same language. So I learned this the hard way. I had a friend and I complimented his pants, and immediately he got red in the face and flustered, very uncomfortable, and explained to me that I had just complimented his underwear because what I was calling pants, he would call trousers. This was a friend from the UK. Another way I learned this the hard way was I asked a friend a pretty benign question like, where's the best place to get coffee? Or where's the restroom? And he put his hands under his chin like we see in the image and then continued to flick his hand and fingers forward towards me. And I was immediately taken aback by this response and later learned that in this culture, this was when I was studying abroad in Argentina, that gesture meant, I don't know, something that we use a very different nonverbal gesture for. Now, as your book talks about, the Sapir-Whorf thesis, or the um, linguistic relativity theory, discusses how important language is, and how language contributes to better understanding and also the maintenance of culture and identity. So language is something very powerful when it comes to culture, and I'll talk about that at the end of this presentation as well. Now, another component of non-material culture are values and beliefs. So values are those things that we define as good or beautiful or desirable, right? And the thing is that actually a lot of our material culture represents the values that we have in society. So, for example, if you were to unpack your backpack, you might find things very similar to those shown in this image, right? And many of these material items reflect underlying values that we have here in the United States. So, for example, many of you probably have a wallet, and inside your wallet is some form of identification, reinforcing our value on individuality, reinforcing our value on belonging, right? And inside your wallet, there may or may not be money, right? Or credit cards, reinforcing this value on money, on, consumerism and the ability to buy things. You might also have keys, right? Keys reflect the value of privacy, of security and safety, of, transportation and movement, independence, right? You may have headphones, reinforcing values on entertainment, on art and music, on anonymity, right? Sometimes it's nice to just put those headphones in, even if there's no music playing, and people tend to leave you alone, right? Mascara or any sort of cosmetic or beauty pop product, reinforcing our values on beauty in the United States and the beauty standards that we have. Cell phones, right? A lot of values reflected in cell phones, values on communication, values on instant gratification if we're looking for information particularly, or access to information, values on social relationships with other people, right? Values on being connected to one another. So a lot of values reflected in the material items that we have. Now, beliefs your book doesn't talk about, but tend to go hand in hand with values. So beliefs are those things that we consider to be true or untrue, real or not real. So, for example, let's think about human life. It's pretty uncontested in the United States that we value human life, right? There are many laws and policies that reflect this value on human life. However, there are differing beliefs on what constitutes human life. This is, again, a very contentious issue, one that is currently being debated across the United States and different governing bodies, right? When does human life begin? Right? And this is a belief, right? So the value is on human life, but again, different beliefs about, well, what constitutes human life. And lastly, I want to talk about norms, right? And so norms are a wonderful component of non-material culture. Norms are the rules and expectations for our behavior. So almost anything you do is informed by the norms in society. And norms can be kind of fun and interesting to examine. So, for example, take this article from 1938 magazine the title, "Men Now Bathe Without Tops on Many Public Beaches," right? Oh, scandalous as that may be. Now, as you think about that title, you might laugh a little bit, and that this idea of men being without tops on beaches is really not something that we consider so scandalous today in the 21st century. And you might also look at these pictures and, get a little chuckle or laugh about the fashion back in the 1930s and how much it differs from beach fashion today. There are different types of norms as well. So one type of norm are mores, right? And so these are norms, as it says here, carry moral significance. Rules or expectations for our behavior, things that we do or do not do because there is a very strong moral association that it's either a very right or a very wrong thing to do. So for example, you might have caught this story last summer where beachgoers make a human chain to save a family. So many of these beachgoers, they didn't know the family, they didn't know each other, but they held on to one another to save a family that was out in the ocean and caught in a riptide, right? They engage in this behavior because, again, that value on human life was something that was so strong and formed the norm that they would risk or sacrifice their own to save these individuals. There are also folkways. So these are rules or expectations for everyday life. So, for example, giving a high five, something we teach children at a really young age. And you probably haven't put too much thought into, when and where we give a high five, but we certainly have rules or expectations for this. We wouldn't expect two men standing at urinals just to high five one another, especially if they didn't know each other. Norms can also be formal and informal. So formal norms refer to those norms that are written into some sort of rule or policy. So any, policies listed in the PVCC handbook would be considered formal norms, or any laws would be considered formal norms. Informal norms are rules or expectations, are kind of like folkways, rules and expectations for everyday life that are not written into law or policy. Things that, when you greet someone for the first time, you tend to extend your hand, grasp the palm of the other person, and shake your hand firmly, but also quite gently up and down, right, as an expression of hello and nice to meet you. Now, it's really important that people behave the way that society expects them to. And the way that we do this, the way that our society keeps people in line, maintains social control and social order, is through sanctions, right? So sanctions are a way to enforce norms. Sanctions are responses to adhering or not adhering to norms. So, for example, as a young child, at some point, the people that took care of you taught you how to pee in the potty and not pee in your pants. And to encourage you to do this, they most likely gave you some sort of reward, as we see here, the young child receiving a lollipop, right? This is a response to that behavior of going in the potty and not in their pants. Conversely, we see an individual here having some sort of run-in with law enforcement, right? And again, this is response most likely to this individual not adhering to the social norms, and the police officer letting this individual know that they did not follow the rules and that there are consequences for such. Now, when we look at sanctions can be either positive or negative, as well as formal and informal. So, for example, a formal positive sanction might be receiving a Nobel Peace Prize, whereas a positive informal sanction might be getting a round of applause after a performance. A negative formal sanction might be being indicted, right? Particularly after you have paid administrators or the admissions office to accept your child into college. And a informal negative sanction would be shh, if you're being too loud in an area where the rule and expectation is to be quiet, right? So again, this chart demonstrates sanctions being both positive and negative, as well as formal and informal. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about cultural change. Now, cultural change can be slow and incremental, or rapid and dramatic, as your book talks about. And one way that culture can change is through technology. Now, I want to talk about this individual, Lenski, who had a theory on sociocultural evolution. And the reason I mention Lenski and his theory on sociocultural evolution is because his theories very closely discuss kind of what your book has talked about in reference to how society has changed over time through technological developments. And so Lenski's theory is that, as people kind of moved from hunter-gatherer societies to agrarian societies to industrial societies to now post-industrial societies, all these changes in the economic structure of these societies had to do with technological developments. And as technology changed, so too did the economic structure of society change. And as the economic structure of society changed, the way of life of the people and the social relationships that the people had also changed, right? And so that, I think, kind of sums up kind of the pretty extensive descriptions and explanations that your book goes into about the way that societies have changed over time. In addition to this change being slow and incremental or rapid and dramatic, we also see what your book talks about as cultural lag. This idea that actually when we look at cultural change, some components of change change much faster than other components. Some components of culture change much faster than other components of culture. Particularly we see material culture changing much more quickly than non-material culture. But, eventually material culture can change non-material culture. So, we look at changes through technology. We see at one time people communicated through this means a telephone, that was attached to a cord, attached to a large instrument that was attached to the wall. And now, we communicate with people in lengthy conversations, even without even verbally talking to them, without being attached to anything else. So I have a bit of a challenge to you. If you are over 50 or know somebody over 50, ask them how their life was different prior to cell phones and after cell phones, right? So if you know somebody that's over 50, most likely you or they have spent a considerable amount of their adult life without a cell phone, and presumably today have a cell phone, as most people in today's society do have cell phones. And in line with what your book talks about, ask them about their happiness. Ask them about how they feel now, that they have this ability to constantly be in communication with others and others constantly in communication with them through their cell phones, along with the myriad of other things that cell phones can do today. How has this change in technology and therefore change in lifestyle, change in norms, change in symbols, change in values, change in beliefs impacted their level of happiness? Other ways that culture can change is through cultural diffusion. So, cultural diffusion refers to the dissemination of beliefs and practices from one group to another. And there's many ways that culture can be transferred or shared with other cultures. So, one way is through products, right? We can go to almost any country in the world and find these two places, McDonald's and Starbucks, right? And as these companies and the products that they bring with them move from one place to another, so does a little bit of the culture. In fact, if you think about it, here in the United States, almost everything that we consume, even on a daily basis, is produced in a different place, in a different country. And many of the products that we utilize and rely on a day-to-day basis are also sourced and manufactured in other parts of the world, right? And so as these different products move from place to place, so does the culture move from place to place. Media is another way that culture is shared or disseminated from one place to another, whether that's through television shows, whether that's through art and music, right? Again, culture is being shared from one place to another. And what better way to do it than through television or the internet? And then lastly, migration. Migration is another way that we see cultural diffusion, movement of people from one place to another, right? And throughout human history, we've constantly seen this movement of people from one place to another. And as your book talks about, and we'll talk about this more throughout this course, this also tends to be a pretty contentious issue, as we see cultural changes and cultural shifts and new exposure to different cultures through the migration of people. We also start to see concerns about what does this mean to the way that one culture will be influenced by another culture. So sociologists, when we talk and think about cultural diffusion, are concerned about a couple of different things. So one concern is this idea of cultural leveling, this idea of cultures becoming more and more similar, right? And so I ask you to think about this. In your mind, picture a strip mall, right? Picture a place with a very large parking lot and all these different stores attached to one another. And maybe there's a Target, and maybe there's a CVS, and maybe there's a TJ Maxx, and maybe there's a pizza shop, a Domino's pizza shop, right? If you were to be blindfolded and uprooted and put into a large parking lot in front of an array of stores like that, would you know where you were? Would you know if you were in Charlottesville, Virginia, or Washington, D.C., or Seattle, Washington, or Phoenix, Arizona, right? Apart from maybe the local landscape, not really. And this is an example of cultural leveling, right? That we can find a very similar strip mall in almost any city in the United States. But we also see this happening on a global scale, especially as I talked about in the previous slide, McDonald's and Starbucks found in almost every country. However, as your book talks about, perhaps this is not happening and won't happen to the extent that some sociologists worry about. Another issue is this issue of cultural imperialism, this imposition of one's cultural practices and beliefs on another's cultural practices and beliefs. And again, the concern here is that one culture is thinking that their practices and beliefs are better than another culture and therefore forcing them on another culture. So one interesting example of this is this statue. So some of you might recognize this. This is a statue of King Kamehameha, right? And so King Kamehameha was a very important leader in Hawaii, responsible for kind of bringing all the people of the different Hawaiian islands together. And so this statue has its origins in 1878. So in 1878, Walter Gibson, who was a non-Polynesian member of the Hawaiian legislature, proposed it in connection with the centennial of Hawaii's discovery, quotations here, by Captain James Cook. So the legislator got a bunch of money together and decided to make this man, Walter Gibson, in charge of the committee. And so Gibson chose this sculptor from Boston named Thomas Gould. Now, Gould actually never went to Hawaii, right? And he also seems to have never learned what Kamehameha looked like, although there were pictures and portraits available to see what he looked like. And in fact, Gould was actually in Italy when he sculpted this. So he actually made the statue look like an Italian with a long Roman cloak. So the statue is essentially that of a Roman general with dark skin. And the features are more Caucasian than Polynesian. The pose with the right arm extended, palm upturned, is supposed to be a welcoming aloha gesture, but it is in fact based on the Roman pose with an upright staff or spear. So this is an example here where in commemoration and memorialization of this king, King Kamehameha, we have this European culture imposed on this memorialized image of this Polynesian man. This is closely connected to the concept of ethnocentrism, right? So this idea of judging another culture by the standards of one's own. Now, this map here is meant to be a bit comical, but it's also meant to be or elicit very real commentary on the United States, particularly the way that people in the United States might view themselves and view others in different countries. And I think it's actually a pretty good example of ethnocentrism, particularly this idea within ethnocentrism that one's cultural practices or standards are better than others' cultural practices or standards. And this can have very real and detrimental consequences to individuals and populations. So ethnocentrism can result in things like prejudice, discrimination, war, and even genocide. So sociologists recommend that individuals practice cultural relativism, this practice of judging all the other cultures by their own standards, right, rather than one's own standards. Now, as your book talks about with female genital cutting, this is not always an easy thing to do. The thing is, when we practice cultural relativism, it really might challenge our deeply held beliefs and deeply held values. So it's not always, sociologists recommend that we do it, particularly to avoid being ethnocentric. It could be something that is indeed very challenging and pretty difficult. So I want to end on this idea of culture versus instinct, right? What makes us who we are? Is it nature? Is it instinct? Is it biology and genetics? Or is it culture? Is it nurture? Is it our environment and our surroundings? So sociologists, in fact, concede that both make us who we are. that it's a little bit of nature and a little bit of nurture, that it's a little bit of culture and a little bit of instinct. The thing is, what we might think of as instinct is most likely culture. We as human beings, particularly when compared to other animals, have very few instincts, and we as human beings couldn't survive without culture. In fact, that's why language is the most important component of culture. Language is the most important component of culture because language is what allows us to pass down culture from one generation to the next. And we need that. In fact, that is what ensures our survival, this passage of culture from one generation to the next. If you think about it, right? If we didn't have that first generation that ate those poisonous berries and died, and then those that didn't eat them pass on to the next generation, hey, those are poisonous, don't eat them, then it would constantly be a trial and error of, oh, what can I eat and not die from, right? So again, sociologists contend it's a little bit of nature and a little bit of nurture, but they focus on culture and argue that it's culture that ensures our survival. We'll explore this concept a little bit more when we get into Chapter 4. Have a great rest of your week, and best as you complete your assignments associated with Chapter 3, Culture.